I am and have always been interested in understanding and trying to articulate what we ought to say about reality now, given all that we know. And for me, given my training and my background, obviously Aristotle and his influence, his ideas are very important. But even before I began studying Aristotle, I studied a lot of Aquinas. I still study Aquinas. And so for me, that's sort of very roughly speaking, what should a Catholic philosopher very deeply shaped by the thought of Aquinas and of Aristotle say about the structure of reality, about the natural world, about the world that God has created and God himself, given what we know at this point in the history of the human race, right? I'm not, let's say, someone who feels the need to agree with Aristotle or with St. Thomas, for that matter, about absolutely everything. But I do want to think it through carefully in light of what I've learned from and continue to learn from Aristotle, from Aquinas, from John Paul II, from other phenomenological thinkers, from the natural sciences and modern mathematics. How does it all come together now? That's really always been the goal, with that apprenticeship to Aristotle as a very important means to that goal.
And so we'll get back to Aristotle, but what would be an example of a problem that comes up from what we know now with in the Aristotelian and Thomistic tradition? What's or if not a problem with that tradition, but something new that can be grafted onto it, perhaps?
So let me give a couple of examples. One will appeal to maybe to some people, others the other to others. Let's take one from natural science. The world that Aristotle depicted for himself as a natural scientist was a world whose basic structure was eternal. The heavens had always been going around the earth in exactly this way, returning upon themselves. The same animals and plants have always been reproducing themselves. And Aristotle thought this not only because of the cyclical structure of life and of the motions of the heavenly bodies as we observe them, but also because he thought that the world was trying to imitate the divine, and the divine is eternal, and therefore the world itself ought to be eternal. Well, then Christianity comes along and says, no, actually, the world is created by God, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end is not the same as the beginning. It's not cyclical. There's a linearity to it. There's a history to it. And Pope Benedict XVI, for example, wrote a doctoral dissertation, I believe it was, on St. Bonaventure's theology of history. And so Christian thinkers began to grapple with the fact that the world has a history and is not eternally stable in its basic structure in the way Aristotle had thought. Well, lo and behold, natural science then follows where Christian theology had led and begins to find empirical evidence that life on Earth has a history and has not always been the same, that the universe itself has a history and has not always been the same, that our planet has not always existed, and so forth. And so whatever we're going to do with Aristotle and Aquinas now, it has to take account of the fact that the reality we belong to is one in which we are capable of contemplating the eternal, but the world to which we belong is not eternal in that way, but has a history, changes, develops over time. So we have to make sense of that, and it takes a lot of work and reflection that was already in progress in Aquinas' time, and is still very much in progress. My second example would be in the attempt to bring together the personalism of various 20th century Christian thinkers, particularly Catholic thinkers, and among them John Paul II, on the one hand, with the Aristotelian tradition on the other. Right? Personalists generally think of reality as thoroughly relational, right? And because reality, what's at the center of reality is persons, and persons exist in relation to one another. And in fact, to talk about a person, apart from the idea of that person being in relation to other persons, there's really no content to that idea at all, right? And that fits very well with Catholic faith in a triune God, right? But it's not clear how well it fits with Aristotle's ultimate view of reality. Aristotle channels in his metaphysics the Greek ideal of independence or autonomy, self-sufficiency, as the standard of being. So the higher a being is, the more independent, the more autonomous it is, in such a way that there's a passage in which Aristotle actually says that the highest being would be so noble that it could not exist in relation to anything at all. Right? So relationality is completely out of the picture when we talk about God. And so that doesn't fit, of course, that doesn't fit Aquinas' understanding of the Trinity, right? But there's work to do there, right? There's work to do. If the traditional distinction between substance and accident, for example, that we find in Aristotle's philosophy, is developed by Aristotle and his successors in a way that privileges independence at the expense of relationality, and 20th century Catholic personalism pushes back very strongly to talk about how things have their being in and through their relations. Well, there is one of those Aristotelian puzzles that I was talking about, where insight has to be attained by figuring out how to untie the knot.